There is no perfect head coaching candidate for the New York Jets. Every single candidate has question marks. Let's talk about the big questions facing potential Jets head coaches today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, January 16th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Well, the Jets are in the middle of a search for a new head coach. Interviews are ongoing. The Jets have interviewed over 10 candidates already, and there are still more to come. The latest candidate is Packers defensive coordinator Jeff Hafley, who was just announced as a candidate yesterday. There is no perfect candidate. There really is no perfect coach in the NFL. And on today's show, I'd like to talk about the big question marks the big Jets candidates face as they try and seek this job. And I get the sense right now the buzz is really surrounding two candidates. Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn, who had a long and productive playing career with the Jets, and Brian Flores, the Vikings defensive coordinator, a familiar name to Jets fans because he was the Dolphins head coach for 3 years from 2019 through 2021. And prior to that, he was part of Bill Belichick's coaching staff with the New England Patriots. So Brian Flores been in the AFC East for a big chunk of his career. And as I mentioned, both of these guys come from the defensive side of the ball. And in today's NFL, I think the number one question facing any head coach with a defensive background, especially a head coach who just was hired, is what is your plan on offense? Because the days where you can simply lean on a defense in the NFL are over. This is a league full of dynamic offenses. Now, that does not mean defense is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, everybody's got a defense. And if your defense is at the top of the league, that's an advantage over the other teams. But there was a day where teams tried to lean exclusively on their defense. They tried to grind out 13-9 types of wins. They tried to, the offense's role was essentially stay out of the way, avoid the big mistake. And that simply doesn't work in today's NFL. And the reason for that is quite simple. It's a league where the best teams are very well-rounded. I hear a lot of talk about how, well, offense is all that matters now. That's not true. Defense is still a very important part of the game, but the best teams have good offenses and good defenses. And sometimes what happens, and I think this is a stereotype that's unfair to a lot of defensive coaches, the perception is that these are guys who are very conservative, who try and win those, grinded out 13-9, 14-10 kind of games, and they're not that interested in throwing the ball. There's also a perception that a head coach from a defensive background is incapable of developing a quarterback. You can just look across the NFL and you can see that that's not true. This weekend, the Buffalo Bills will play Josh Allen, developed under the tutelage of Sean McDermott, who is a head coach with a defensive background. And what McDermott has hired excellent offensive coordinators during his time as Bills head coach. It's not really about being a glorified offensive coordinator. Now, there are some great offensive coaches who kind of take on a lot of the offensive coordinator duties. Andy Reid with the Chiefs is one of them. Kyle Shanahan with the 49ers, another. Sean McVay with the Rams, another. But that's not the only pathway to have a successful head coach. What being a head coach in this league really means is understanding what your strengths are, understanding what you bring to the table, and then hiring coaches who can fill in the blanks, bringing in guys who can help you out with the areas where you're not as strong. You don't need a glorified offensive coordinator to be your head coach in order to have success in this league. There's this mindset that you have to hire a coach from an offensive background because, well, if you hire a coach who doesn't come from an offensive background, his offensive coordinator may get poached someday, and then your offense is back to square one. You hire a coach with a defensive background, he brings in a great offensive coordinator. Well, you lose that offensive coordinator eventually because he becomes a head coach. Now, I think you could probably guess why this reasoning is faulty. It's kind of crazy, in my opinion, to base a decision as important as the head coach you hire on a hypothetical that may come to pass a few years down the line. I mean, if you get to a position where teams want to hire your offensive coordinator as head coach, that's a very positive thing. It means that your team's successful. It means that your offense was successful. But I mean, look across the league. Every good head coach does not come from an offensive background. Sean McDermott, the Bills have had issues in big games, of course. We'll see how things go this weekend. But the Bills have been a very successful team. The Bills are in the final 8 every year. The Pittsburgh Steelers with Mike Tomlin. I know Tomlin, it's been a while since there's all this controversy around Tomlin in Pittsburgh because there's a feeling that he's stagnated a little bit. But the bottom line is the guy's been a head coach for almost 2 decades and never once had a losing season. John Harbaugh, a Super Bowl winning coach, a guy who always has Baltimore at the top of the league. He came from a special teams background. And Dan Campbell. Now, Dan Campbell nominally, I guess, was a tight ends coach. So I guess technically he comes from the offensive side of the ball. But Dan Campbell is not the guy calling plays. Dan Campbell had no experience as a play caller. Dan Campbell's a great leader. And if you lose your offensive coordinator, you hire a new one. You find somebody new to replace him. That's what Buffalo did. Buffalo lost Brian Daboll a few years back. They hired Ken Dorsey, who was let go. It wasn't let go because the offense struggled. I think it was more of a personality thing. But Joe Brady took over in Buffalo and has done a pretty good job. Good teams find quality coaches. If the most important person in your organization is your offensive coordinator, you are a garbage organization because there's no way a professional football team should fall apart because the offensive coordinator leaves. Every great quarterback has lost their offensive coordinator at one point through the years. So it's not about, you can only find a good head coach if he has an offensive background. The question is, if you don't come from an offensive background, how do you build the offense? Because that's critical. The old cliche, which is true. It is a passing league. So the questions for Aaron Glenn and Brian Flores: what are you going to do with the offensive side of the ball? What coach are you going to bring in? Lots of rumors right now that Brian Flores is going to be a package deal with Vikings quarterback coach Josh McCown, who is a familiar name to Jets fans because he was the Jets quarterback in 2017 and then came back and was kind of Sam Darnold's mentor in 2018. Now, McCown's only technically been a coach for 2 years, but during his playing career, he was kind of known as a guy who was a coach on the field. He was a mentor to Darnold. He was a guy who was really helpful to young quarterbacks, and he played in a really long time in the league at the quarterback position. So while McCown hasn't called plays as a coach, when you're a quarterback for as long as McCown was, and you played for as many teams as McCown did, you've gotten exposure to so many different playbooks. You've had a chance to learn like every different offensive philosophy and take the best parts of those. And when you're a quarterback for as long as McCown has, you really do have experience play calling. You understand what defenses are trying to do. You understand what adjustments need to be made at the line of scrimmage. You have a sense of how the flow of the game should impact your play calling. I actually would argue McCown does have experience. I think McCown answer would be a good answer to that question. With Glenn, the answers are less clear. Now, the positive for Glenn is that he's got exposure to a couple good offensive coaching trees. He, of course, works in Detroit with Ben Johnson. Of course, Ben Johnson's not going to be the offensive coordinator for Aaron Glenn. Ben Johnson very well may be a head coach in the league himself. But Detroit has a talented offensive coaching staff. Before Glenn went to the Lions, he was part of the Saints coaching staff, so he's got exposure to the Sean Payton coaching tree. So there are some good options for Aaron Glenn. That's less clear. So the key, though, and this is a really important thing to remember, and it goes for the Jets and it goes for other teams as well. It's not about having a head coach with an offensive background. It's about having a head coach who can build an offense. You can build an offense the way Andy Reid or Sean McVay or Kyle Shanahan do and be very hands-on. But there are very successful coaches in this league. There are very successful offenses in this league on teams where the head coach has a defensive background. Because if you think about it, if you're a head coach with a defensive background, you should value offense. You should value the modern offenses, the way these modern formations, the way these modern play concepts stress at defense. You should want one of those for your own team. The issue is never in hiring a head coach with a defensive background. It's in hiring a head coach with a defensive background who has the wrong philosophies. And these are things I think Flores and Glenn would need to answer if they were hired as head coach of the Jets. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to some other candidates. There's some candidates who want a second chance with the Jets. And most of these candidates did not do so well their first go around as an NFL head coach. What will be different next time? That's the question I have for a few candidates as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. Of course, it was a difficult Jets season, and it was difficult to put money down on the Jets. A lot of fans don't like betting against their team. The good thing about the playoffs here is that you don't have to worry about that with the Jets. The Jets are not in it. So again, FanDuel is the place to get in on the action. Visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we're talking about the big questions facing potential candidates to be the next Jets head coach. And I'm going to move on to a group that are kind of like retreads, guys who have been head coaches in the NFL in the past and now are looking for a second opportunity. Now, my view on like guys getting the second chance are kind of nuanced. Through much of the process before he was hired by the Patriots, Mike Vrabel was my top choice. And a lot of that goes back to the way the Jets are run and Jets ownership, and Woody Johnson, who's just shown an inability to pick out promising young coaches. Since Woody Johnson bought this team, he has made, or he or his brother, because he was his way in England for 4 years, he or his brother have made 6 head coaching hires, and 5 of them have been first-time head coaches. The only head coach they've hired who had any experience was Adam Gase, which I don't even know if that counts. But it's kind of instructive because part of the reason I wanted Vrabel was that he's the proven commodity. But it's not just that he had experience, it's that he had experience with success. And I don't know that really any of the other candidates the Jets are interviewing who have a track record as a head coach in the NFL have had success. I mean, I think a lot of these coaches have track records, but these track records are not good. And in this category, you can throw in Arthur Smith, the Steelers offensive coordinator, who was a former Falcons head coach, Matt Nagy, Chiefs offensive coordinator, who was the head coach of the Chicago Bears for 4 years. You could throw in Vance Joseph, Broncos defensive coordinator, who years back was actually the Broncos head coach. An interesting scenario playing out in Denver where they hired their former head coach as the defensive coordinator. And even Steve Spagnuolo, who one of the great defensive coordinators in the history of the league, guy with 4 Super Bowl rings as a defensive coordinator, a guy who maybe doesn't get his due. The last 2 of the 3 Chiefs Super Bowls over the last 5-6 years have been on the backs of a dominant defense that Spagnuolo has run. And he also was the architect of the game plan back in Super Bowl 42, where the Giants beat the then 18-0 Patriots and denied Tom Brady and Bill Belichick a non-defeated season. Spagnuolo was the coach of the Rams for 3 years. He was actually Jets head coaching candidate back in 2009 when they hired Rex Ryan. Now, all of these coaches were unsuccessful. Arthur Smith had 3 7-10 seasons. Matt Nagy got off to a great start. His first season with the Bears, they were 12-4. They won the NFC North. After that, a couple 8-8 seasons, a losing season, things did not go well. And Mitch Trubisky, who was the quarterback Nagy inherited from his predecessor, John Fox, did not really develop. I don't know how much you can blame that on Nagy. Vance Joseph, his Broncos tenure was just horrible. The Broncos looked undisciplined. They looked unprepared. They looked poorly coached through much of his tenure. And Spagnuolo, while he's got one of the best records as an assistant coach in the league, his tenure with the Rams, it was ugly. Now, that was a long time ago. It was 2009 through 2011. The Rams were in St. Louis. It was so long ago, the Rams were in St. Louis. So again, that tells you the difference. But the question is, what's going to be different this time? And it's difficult to look at a coach who failed in the previous stop and think things are going to be different the second time around. Occasionally it happens, though. I mean, if we're going to be objective, most of the time you have a coach who failed the first time, there isn't enough that changes the second time around for them to have success. But it does happen. Bill Belichick failed his first tenure in Cleveland, went to New England, won 6 Super Bowls. Pete Carroll, what's interesting with Pete Carroll is he was the Jets head coach in 1994 and got fired after 1 year. And a lot of people say, well, the Jets, of course, vintage Jets, they fire this guy who's going to be a great coach. But the Jets in 94 collapsed. The Jets ended the season on a 6-game losing streak. They were completely undisciplined. The problem for the Jets was they hired Pete Carroll before he was ready to be a head coach, because Pete Carroll then, a few years later, went to the New England Patriots and replaced Bill Parcells. And the Patriots got worse every year of his tenure, and he got fired. It wasn't until he went to USC when he really started to figure things out. And one of the things Carroll figured out was that he needed total control over the operation, because in New England, they had a GM who, really kind of messed up their salary cap. Carroll kind of feels like that was part of the reason he failed there. With the Jets, Carroll was just, not ready to be a head coach. But Carroll eventually figured it out. He had a great run with USC. He won 2 national championships, almost won. It was a play away from winning a third against Texas in the 2006 Rose Bowl. Then went to the Seahawks and won a Super Bowl, and again was a play away from winning a second Super Bowl. If he just ran the ball with Marshawn Lynch on the goal line a decade ago. So it does happen. Even Todd Bowles to a lesser extent. Todd Bowles has won 3 straight division titles as head coach of Tampa Bay. I remember when he was with the Jets, there was all this talk about people actually said Todd Bowles was worse than Rich Kotite when he was here. And people, it's funny because Todd Bowles was paired with general manager Mike McCagnon, and at the time there was a very popular theory. I think most people believe this, is that Bowles was the one sabotaging McCagnon. There was this theory that Bowles was such a bad coach that McCagnon's quality work was being obscured. Of course, that was not true at the time. That claim was on shaky ground, but that's what people said at the time. Bowles was not a good coach though with the Jets, and it does seem like he's learned some lessons, especially when you talk about his offensive coordinator hires, because his offensive coordinator hires in Tampa have been very good. His offensive coordinator hires with the Jets were, for the most part, pretty shaky. So I think Bowles has learned his lesson. The question is, what's going to be different this time? Because all 4 of these coaches I mentioned really did not show themselves to have the stuff to be a head coach during their first go round. And look, part of it's like, somebody like Nagy got paired with a quarterback who wasn't very good. And you know what? Coaches always take the blame when the quarterback fails. That's just a fact of life in the NFL. Sometimes the quarterback's just not good enough, but people don't want to hear that. People blame the head coach. And it's true to some extent that, every coach I've named, every coach in this category was done in by a shaky quarterback situation. Arthur Smith did not have great quarterback play during his tenure with Atlanta. Spagnuolo was stuck with Sam Bradford, who was, very mediocre quarterback himself. And the Denver quarterback situation under Vance Joseph was never anything to write home about. So, look, part of it is not having a quarterback. But I think all 4 of these coaches failed in different ways during their first tenure. And I think any of these hires would be met with some degree of skepticism. I think Spagnuolo would be probably the least of them because he's had a long time to recover and his reputation is quite good. But there are also some guys who are just better coordinators than they are head coaches. Or some coaches are excellent coordinators and terrible head coaches. Wade Phillips was a perfect example of that. A guy who really belongs in the Hall of Fame for his work as a defensive coordinator across multiple teams, but was constantly underachieving as a head coach. I think you'd have to just hope that they learned from the failures the first time, that they've figured it out, what went wrong. I mean, part of one of the positives is that these coaches have failed and gone on and worked in successful organizations as coordinators. All of them are working under really good head coaches now. The 2 Kansas City coordinators working under Andy Reid, Arthur Smith working under Mike Tomlin, Vance Joseph working under Sean Payton. So they've gotten a chance to observe how good teams do it and maybe compare with what did not work in the past for them. But it is a tough ask. I don't think any of these hires would be particularly popular. I think that these hires would be difficult to get behind. I think to talk yourself into it, these coaches would need to explain what went wrong last time and how it's going to be different this time. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to some coaches who are just kind of blank slates. And the question for them is really, what's the plan, period? What are you going to do here? And we'll talk about who those candidates might be as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? You may have a few subscriptions that you don't even realize you're paying for, and Rocket Money makes it easy to track down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. If you're like me and you don't keep track of your subscriptions, I'm so bad about that. Rocket Money is the place to go. It'll help you track down the things you don't want to pay for. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon, rocketmoney.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Thursday. We're talking about questions for Jets head coaching candidates. Now, there are some candidates out there who are kind of wild cards, who may not be in the top tier, but are really, in many ways, blank slates. And I think the question for them is, what's your overall plan? One of the things that can be a mistake is just looking at a coach and judging them purely on their resume, because there are some coaches who don't really need a lot of experience to be able to step in and run the team. And there are just certain things you need, like overall leadership, which I know is vague, but that's always cited as one of the top ingredients for a successful head coach. You need to understand how you're going to staff your team. What do you want your philosophy to be on offense? What do you want your philosophy to be on defense? And who are the coaches who can help implement the philosophy? Who are the coaches who have the same views as you and have the competence to implement what you want to do? What's your in-game strategy? How aggressive do you want to be going for it on fourth downs? What's your overall vision for the organization? Do you want to draft a quarterback this year? Do you want to go the veteran route? These are the things you need to think about. And for me, it's less a question of, do you have a lot of experience as a coordinator? Because there are actually a lot of coaches who have been successful as head coaches who had minimal to no experience as coordinators. When the Steelers hired Mike Tomlin, he had 1 year of experience as Minnesota's defensive coordinator. Andy Reid had never been a coordinator when the Philadelphia Eagles hired him back in 1999. If you're looking for a more modern example, Kevin O'Connell was not a guy who was overloaded with experience when he was hired by the Minnesota Vikings a few years back. It's not really about your resume. I mean, there are some coaches who have phenomenal resumes, who just, Super Bowl champions as coordinators, worked under the right head coaches, worked under great head coaches, but can't handle the top job. There are always some people who are better as the second in command than the top person. So I look at certain candidates in this search, and I don't know that these are the top tier candidates. One is Darren Rizzi of the Saints. He was the Saints special teams coach. He also took over as their interim head coach through much of this past season, after the Saints fired Dennis Allen. And one of the challenges special teams coordinators face is, they don't come from either side of the ball. So normally you're hiring a coach from the offensive side of the ball or the defensive side of the ball. So you at least have a philosophy there. I think that there's some concern when owners make a hire, if they go for the special teams coordinator, then essentially this coach will depend on this coach will need to delegate both sides of the ball. That's not the end of the world, though. I mean, there are coaches who are very successful doing that. John Harbaugh was a special teams coach for almost his entire NFL career before the Ravens hired him. He spent 1 year as Philadelphia's secondary coach, but I don't think he has a hands-on role in the Baltimore defense. John Harbaugh is like the ultimate CEO style head coach. I would argue Dan Campbell's another head coach is kind of like a CEO style, where he knows what he wants in the offense, he knows what he wants in the defense, and he can go get it. I think there's something to be said for somebody who can oversee both sides of the ball. Maybe he delegates the specifics to his coordinators, but it gives you a certain degree of flexibility, because if you see something's not working, or you see like one of your systems has fallen out of date, you can make a change. You're not stuck in your own system. I think sometimes having that 30,000 foot view where you're not running your system, where you're allowing the assistants to do their thing, is beneficial from the standpoint that it gives you an opportunity to make a change. It gives you more flexibility to shake things up when they need to be shaken up. If you're a coach with an offensive background, you're pretty much going to run your offense. And if things fall out of date, there's nothing that, sometimes you get a little tunnel vision and you're not willing to modernize things. I think there could be a benefit to that. A couple really young, inexperienced coaches, Brian Griese, who the Jets have requested an interview from, the quarterbacks coach of the 49ers, and Josh McCown, who's has been mentioned as a potential pairing with Brian Flores if Flores gets a head coaching job. Could these guys be the next great offensive coach? It's difficult to say. I mean, one of the things about hirings like these is that you're kind of taking a leap of faith, because hirings like those, nobody really knows how good they're going to be. You're kind of just taking an educated guess. You're making a calculated gamble. Did you found like the next hot young coach? The question is, do they have like that viewpoint? Have they thought through like all of the inner workings of an NFL organization? It's one thing to coach a position, but just because you're coaching a position doesn't mean that you lack the leadership skills. Doesn't mean that you lack the big picture thinking skills to run the entire ship. And then another coach who kind of comes to mind, like this is the latest candidate, Jeff Hafley, who improved the Packers defense tremendously this past season. Prior to that, though, he spent a lot of time in college, and he was the head coach at Boston College and was very mediocre at BC. In fact, he took the Packers job. He was kind of like a step ahead of the BC people, because he was on the verge of, he was probably like one bad season away from really being on the hot seat. So I think he kind of got out of town before his job was in major jeopardy. after spending most of his career in college, the question is, and he did have a good season this year with Green Bay, but the bulk of Hafley's career has been in college. I think there's a question with him is, how is college different from the NFL? Because Hafley's time at BC was not very successful. That's not necessarily the end of the world. There are coaches who have failed, who've really been bad college coaches who end up succeeding in the NFL. It's a different skill set. It's a different type of player you're dealing with, different ways to relate with them. So I don't know that it's the end of the world that Hafley failed at BC, but I think running an NFL program is different from running a college program. College, the bulk of the work is done on recruiting. Whereas the NFL, it's more about adjusting your scheme from week to week. In college, you can yell at the players more. The coach is more in charge. Whereas in the pros, it's more of a partnership where you have to speak with them on their level. These are adjustments Hafley will need to explain. I think his work this year with Green Bay would be a positive thing for him, certainly, because he has shown that he can succeed in the NFL level running a defense, but running the entire operations a bit of a different story. So that's something Hafley would need to explain. And any of these hires off this from this group, again, it's kind of a leap of faith. You're kind of just hoping that you've caught on to the next great candidate. I don't know that I'd love the Jets doing this because I don't know that I can trust Woody Johnson to identify the next great candidate, but it's certainly something worth watching. If one of the top tier candidates falls through, maybe this is a direction the Jets will go. We'll just have to wait and see. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.